Alright, today we're going to talk about the skin and specifically looking into Chapter 4 in your textbook, reviews the skin, so you can follow along with some pictures there. These lecture notes are found in the folder, the lecture folder, under skin or integumentary system. And to begin, I want to watch a little introductory video on the skin that kind of summarizes the basic concept of how the skin functions in the body. So we'll go ahead and start with that.
At the surface of it all, a velvety overcoat of cells and protein keeps us in, and the rest of the world out. It is our armor, our radiator, our entree to pain and pleasure. It is the body's largest organ, our skin. Smooth and silky to the eyes and touch. A closer look presents a very different landscape. Magnified 600 times, our outermost skin is nothing but dead cells. Riddled with ridges and grooves, and pocked with countless bumps and holes. Look closer still, and we find hundreds of thousands of bacteria inhabit every square inch of us. With every tick of the clock, our dead skin gets sloughed off. We shed at least 600,000 particles of skin an hour. About 1.5 pounds worth each year, which accounts for as much as 80% of the dust in our houses. But there's plenty of skin to go around. If we could peel it off and lay it out flat, the average person's skin would cover some 18 square feet. Though just millimeters thick, it would weigh about 6 pounds. And we're constantly making more. Just wait a month or so, and you too will have a shiny new coat. Which means skin can't be all dead. Dip below the surface, and you find cells continuously dividing to replace those dead cells above. Miles of blood vessels pulse to skin's connective tissues. And let's not forget all those precious nerve endings. 45 miles worth of nerves stretch from our heads down to our toes. And many reach to our skin. Some parts more than others. If sensitivity were size dependent, we would look something like this. Our super-sensitive hands, feet, tongue, and lips, each packed with touch receptors, would swell enormously. Our legs, on the other hand, would resemble a chicken's. Good thing for us, there is more to this organ than touch. Skin is also our heating and cooling system. And by helping maintain that comfy 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, it keeps us alive. Through its network of blood vessels, skin carries as much as 1/3 of the heart's hot, freshly pumped blood. Get too hot, and these vessels can widen to release heat from our bodies. But sometimes, that's not enough. A good workout can raise the body's temperature several degrees above normal, a potentially deadly state if it weren't for skin's slick safety net: sweat. The more than 2 million holes across our skin can produce up to a half gallon of the liquid in an hour. The heated droplets evaporate into the air and leave the body cool. Through a special camera that images heat, not light, we can see this air conditioning system at work. The hotter the body, the deeper the red. No surprise, some of the warmest parts of our bodies, our foreheads, palms, and armpits, correlate with the greatest concentration of sweat glands. But we're more likely to encounter the opposite extreme in our morning routine. Exposed to a chill, tiny muscles jerk our hairs to attention, bulging the skin around them. We call them goosebumps.
All right, going back to our notes then. Nice little video. Makes you rethink the dust that's collecting on your furniture. Maybe we all should dust a little more or get a filter on our vacuum cleaner. So moving on then, looking at the integumentary system. We looked at the structures already in the lab discussion, so now we'll just talk about the functions. One of the main functions of the skin is protection, and that's this top layer, the epidermis. That's the protective layer, because we know if we cut our skin, that is an entry for bacteria into our deeper tissues, which are sterile. And if that bacteria gets deep enough, it can enter into the bloodstream and cause sepsis, which is infection within the blood, and a person can die from that. So it's very important that our skin is intact. Sensation, we know that we have sensory receptors in the dermis, that if there's any temperature changes or pressure or anything that would cause a painful sensation or an abnormal sensation such as itching, we're going to sense that, and that helps protect the body from damage. So it's good to have sensation in our skin so we can take care of ourselves. If there's an injury or temperature changes, we can make adjustments and respond to that by keeping our skin intact and healthy. Temperature regulation, we know that there are sweat glands in the skin. They help release sweat, so when the body temperature gets too high, we can release a liquid on the surface, and as that liquid evaporates off the surface, we feel cooler. Same thing with the erector pili muscles. Remember that they can contract and pull the hair upright to trap hair at the surface, which are goosebumps. And vitamin D production. This is an important vitamin that we need in our body. It helps us to absorb calcium in our small intestine. It has a number of functions as well, but that's the primary function, is getting enough vitamin D in our system to help us absorb calcium. And here in the Midwest, especially in the wintertime, we don't have access to sunlight to produce this vitamin D because the skin produces vitamin D in the presence of UV light. So as a result, we supplement our milk with vitamin D. You'll notice on every gallon of milk you buy at the grocery store, it's going to say vitamin D fortified. That ensures that we're absorbing the calcium from that milk. And low levels of vitamin D have also been implicated in seasonal depression. People find themselves a little more blue, a little more down in the wintertime, less energy. And again, that can be because of lack of vitamin D due to lack of sun exposure. And one of the treatments for depression in some places that are more holistic in their approach will actually just be light therapy to help stimulate that vitamin D production. And there was a number of studies done on vitamin D levels and depression, and they have found that those with mild to moderate depression were helped with some vitamin D supplementation because there seems to be a link on low levels of vitamin D and depression. Excretion is another function of the skin. So as we secrete sweat, we are also excreting some wastes. For example, urea is something that is found in sweat. So that is a way of excreting some waste products from the body, is through sweat. So the skin is made up of two major layers. The dermis is the structural layer that gives the skin its strength. So it's not as easily damaged or sloughed away like the epidermis is. And if someone is getting a tattoo, for example, they're going to insert that tattoo ink into the dermis. If we're stitching together the skin after surgery or after an injury, a laceration, those stitches are going to be foot into the dermis. That's what's going to hold that skin together and allow it to heal. The epidermis is this top layer here. We said it has this wavy bottom border. It's mostly layers of dead cells. It provides a waterproof, protective outer layer for our skin, preventing water loss and entry of foreign substances, but it has no blood vessels. If you look at the layer here on this diagram, you'll see there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. So any blood supply to these cells is coming from the blood vessels in the dermis. As a result, we find that the only living layer of the epidermis is this bottom layer, the stratum basale. As cells rise up toward the surface, as cells in the basale undergo mitosis, we find that these cells slowly die. And at the surface, in this top layer of the epidermis, the stratum corneum, it's mostly dead. It's all dead cells with just keratin inside them. All the organelles have died because of lack of oxygen and nutrients due to the diminishing blood supply as these cells migrate away from the dermis. So if we look at the epidermis, this top layer, it's mostly keratinocytes, cells that contain keratin. So that waterproofs the skin. We talked about that, how that provides a waxy waterproofing layer on the surface of the skin. And also we find melanocytes. Recall that the melanocytes are found in the stratum basale. They produce the pigment melanin, which gives the skin its brown color. We also find these melanocytes in the iris of the eye and also in the hair. So they give, again, the skin its brown color. The more melanin production, the browner the skin and hair and eyes. There's two processes that occur in the epidermis. You need to know the definition of these two processes. The first one is to desquamate. When cells are desquamating, it basically means we have these squamous cells that are sloughing off on the surface of the epidermis. Excessive desquamination would be an example of that would be dandruff. Too many cells are sloughing off at the surface, and you can see that those flaky cells that collect on the shoulders of people that are wearing maybe a dark suit coat or a dark top. When we have too much sloughing, that can damage the layers beneath. So that stratum corneum is protective, but if we have too much sloughing, we can lose that stratum corneum, and then there might be damage to the cell layers below, and that would cause redness and irritation. So it's important to control excessive desquamination. Keratinization is that process where we talked about where cells in the stratum basale, as they undergo mitosis and rise up toward the surface of the epidermis, those cells die as they get further from the blood supply in the dermis. As a result of that, the benefit of that is these organelles become concentrated with keratin, which is we said a protein that helps waterproof the skin, provides that hard waxy layer on the surface, and that resists abrasion and again prevents things from entering and leaving, so it provides a waterproofing layer as well. So keratinization is definitely a beneficial process by which we form a protective outer layer on our skin. And desquamation is good as well because as we slough off those cells at the surface, we're replacing them down below through the stratum basale. So it's good to have some desquamination, and if you remember from the video, every 30 days we get a new layer of skin on the surface. But that is only true for people that are young and healthy. As we age, this process slows down again, and we don't have as much turnover of our skin on the outer layers. So again, looking at the two layers of the epidermis, there's more than two. We can see here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers, but we're focusing in our class on the very top layer, which is the stratum corneum, and the bottom layer, which is the stratum basale. You can see the cells here are very different in their appearance. The stratum corneum has flattened squamous cells, no organelles, just keratin in concentrated amounts. The cell in the stratum basale, very plump cells. We can see organelles in there. We can see a nucleus with a nucleolus and these granules of keratin. So again, these undergo mitosis in the stratum basale. These do not, and they are sloughed off at the surface because they are essentially dead cells. And again, the tissue type that we find in the stratum corneum is stratified squamous epithelium. The hypodermis is that layer of the underneath the skin. It is not part of the skin, so that's really a key concept that you should highlight and underline. Hypodermis is not part of the skin. That's why it's called the subcutaneous layer, sub meaning below and cutaneous meaning skin, so subcutaneous, below the skin. And it's made up of primarily fat and loose connective tissue or areolar tissue that we talked about in lab. So this provides a cushion underneath the skin. So when we bump ourselves, we don't damage ourselves as easily because we have a little bit of a cushiony layer underneath the skin. Fat also serves as an insulator. So people that have more of a fat layer will have less tendency to get cold in the wintertime. So, for example, if you go into a nursing home where people have lost a lot of fat tissue with age, we find that the temperature can be 80 degrees in the nursing home, and the residents will have on a long sleeve shirt and a sweater, pants, shoes, socks, and complain of feeling chilly. Again, that's because they lost the fat in that hypodermis, that subcutaneous layer. So when you look at the color of the skin from the outside, it's controlled by different pigments. The main pigment we talked about is the melanin that gives the skin its brown color, or lack thereof if there's less melanin production. And then there's blood that's circulating through that dermis that gives the skin its color. For example, the reddish color we see when we're hot or when we blush or angry or inflammation, that's due to increased blood flow to the dermis. And as a result, that increased blood flow dilates those blood vessels, and you see that color on the surface. The same thing happens when we get hot. Our body is trying to get rid of excess heat, so those blood vessels will dilate, and we're going to see redness of the skin when we're exercising. Cyanosis, cyan is the art word for blue. So cyanosis is a condition, and when you look at a patient that looks like they have blue lips, blue nail beds, that's a sign of poor oxygenation. It doesn't mean that the blood is blue, it just means that the blood is carrying less oxygen and it gives a bluish hue or cast to the skin. It does not mean the blood is blue. Blood is never blue. Blood is either bright red when it's well oxygenated or dark red when it's poorly oxygenated. So when blood is dark red, it gives this bluish color to the skin. We call that cyanosis. And that's a bad sign. That's usually a later sign of some real problems with the respiratory or cardiovascular system. So our lips are red because there's fewer layers of stratum corneum over the surface of the lips, and that's why they appear red. What's the benefit of having fewer layers? Well, our lips are very sensitive. You might notice when you're feeling the surface of maybe a bump on your hand or anything, the lips are very sensitive for that. If you're feeling for temperature, say in a child with a fever, we typically put the child's forehead to our lips because they're very sensitive. And you saw in the video too how the size of the lips increased if they were showing size compared to sensitivity. And they look red again because of the fewer layers of the epidermis. And you'll notice in the wintertime the lips are the first to get chapped again because they have less of that waterproofing waxy outer layer. And lastly, the thicker the stratum corneum, the more of a change in color we would see. For example, the hands look maybe slightly orange if they have a thicker stratum corneum, say a construction worker, or the bottoms of the feet can also have an orangish, yellowish hue to them if someone walks around barefoot a lot. So the more layers of stratum corneum they have, the more yellow, orangish they're going to appear. Accessory structures that we find in the skin, most of them originate in the dermis. The hair we see all over the body except for these areas that are shown in blue here. And there's several different glands that we find in the dermis. Sebaceous glands, another name for those, are the oil glands. We find those associated with hair follicles. And sweat glands are isolated by themselves, and they secrete their contents via a pore to the surface, and that's for body temperature control. There are two types of sweat glands. These are for body temperature. There's another type, we'll talk about in a little bit, that are more responsible, or they're primarily found in the armpit, genital, and anal areas. Those are not for temperature control. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But ceruminous glands, or wax glands, are modified sweat glands that produce wax instead of sweat. And we find that lining the ear canal. Mammary glands also are modified sweat glands, and we find these in the female breast, and their job is to secrete milk. So we do see some modifications of sweat glands throughout the body, but again, they're similar functions, that they secrete a substance via this network of tubules that rise to the surface. Nails we're not going to talk a lot about. If you go into the nursing program, you'll learn how to analyze nails, looking for vitamin deficiencies, oxygen deficiencies. There's a lot of information that can be taken by looking at a person's nails, but we'll save that for your programs. Here's an example of overactive oil glands in the skin of a baby, which contributes to cradle cap. You get this crusty yellow collection of debris on the surface, and it's best treated by just warm washcloth, sometimes rubbing a little baby oil into that helps break it up and wash it off. And by the age of about 6 to 9 months, that usually resolves on its own, nothing to be concerned about. But sometimes if it gets really bad, the doctor might recommend an anti-dandruff shampoo to help control it. But again, it resolves on its own. So we will break at this point, and I will pick up with part 2 of our lecture, and we'll continue talking about structures within the dermis.